Protesters are staging a die-in.
There were literally several hundred people here at this particular spot.
Black Lives Matter!
We never discuss race until something bad happens.
Are you worried about animosity in minority communities when it comes to police?
Sure. I've been a cop for 44 years. I've been aware of animosity since I first began as a white cop working in an all-black neighborhood.
We're also people, we're humans. We understand what they go through, so we have to help them out,
What's the most important thing to do?
Understanding. When we did our first Black in America documentary, and white people would say to me, well, I tell my children they should be respectful of the police. And black people would say, I teach my son how to survive an interaction with the police.
I am the conversation.
I'm a part of the conversation.
And I am part of the conversation.
I am the conversation.
And I'm a part of the conversation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, you could do better than that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We are so grateful that you are here with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
It's incredible. It's our 7th installment of the Black in America series. What an incredible accomplishment. We are just very fortunate to have you here with us. Why did you choose Black and Blue as this installment?
You know, it's interesting. We started working on this documentary, and as we were working on the documentary, which honestly was a conversation that was happening in the African-American community from the time we started our first Black in America, this idea of a conversation that black parents were having with their children, that often white parents, not only were they not having with their children, they weren't even aware that that conversation was happening, and that conversation was one of not just pay attention to police, listen to police, respect the police, but this is how you get through an interaction. Here's what you do with your hands. Here is how you behave. Do not reach for your cell phone. All these very specific things, regardless of the socioeconomic status. Rich people, middle-class people, poor people would tell exactly the same story if they were black. So this is something we knew was an issue in the black community. We decided to focus on it because we wanted to look at stop and frisk, specifically in New York City, which had come under a lot of challenge. At that same time, while we were shooting, you had the Mike Brown shooting, you had the Eric Garner killing, and so it seemed like it was just a perfect time to have what was a very uncomfortable conversation, but clearly a conversation whose time had come.
And a conversation that was happening in private, but you made it very public. And while the documentary focuses on New York City, Brooklyn specifically, there's a correlation to what's happening around the nation. The
Absolutely,
same conversation.
Right? Exactly. We wanted to look at policing in America and why there are certain communities in this country that feel like they are not justly treated in the eyes of the law.
Now, in the documentary, if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, hopefully you can attend one of the tour locations, or you'll get to catch it in another way. You can find out more information on the Facebook page for Black in America. You become very invested in two men, specifically two young minority men, Keyshawn and Louis, whose interactions with the police have forever changed their mind. Why those two?
I thought they were a great example. Keyshawn Harley is 19 years old. He is... He fits the description, he would say. He is a young black male between the ages of 19 and 25, and he describes being stopped 100 times from the time he is 13 years old in his own neighborhood in Bed-Stuy. And he describes not just what it's like to be stopped and kind of pushed up against a wall and have someone, a police officer, go through your stuff, but how humiliating it is. And then how after a while it's infuriating. And then after a while you're just so angry, you just don't know what to do. And I thought it was a really interesting look at the psychology of what it's like for someone who lives in these communities. I mean, if you look at the statistics behind stop and frisk, one of the reasons that a judge eventually said that it was unconstitutional was the sheer numbers. Almost 5 million people were stopped in New York City, 4.4 million people between 2003 2013. 84% of them, roughly, were Black or Latino, mostly men. 90%, 90% did not have a weapon, had not committed a crime, were not given a summons, they were guilty of nothing. And so the question becomes, is it okay to stop 90% of the people in a community when they've done nothing? And what does that do to someone who is stopped all the time? I think Keyshawn Harley was a really good example of what it feels like to be a young Black man who's on his way to college, who's stopped consistently while his professors are walking by, while his friends from college are walking by, and just feeling incredibly ashamed that, once again, you fit the description.
And one of the things that, as a mother, myself as a mother, yourself and many of us in the audience, the involvement of the parents was quite proactive, but complacent, kind of just, this is just what happens, and we don't want to see our kids get killed. The mentality of, do you know how hard it is to get a young Black boy in this neighborhood?
His mother wants him to go to college, and Keyshawn is at the stage where he feels like he's stopped so frequently, and he's so angry that he just feels like, this is ridiculous, I should just stop. And his mother's thinking, well, now we're going to put at risk a college education, which I've worked pretty hard for, because he's constantly stopped, and it seems brutally unfair. And she references in the documentary, she's like, well, Dr. King, he put up with the dogs, and he kept going, and they firebombed his house, and he, just plowed ahead anyway. And Keyshawn's kind of like, well, I don't necessarily want to do that. And his mother asks, well, then what's the choice? Like, what do you do? And I think that's kind of the $64,000 question, is how do you police a community without the assumption that every single young Black man or young man of color in that community is guilty of a crime? How are you able to keep people safe and serve the people in the community without criminalizing the people in the community at the same time? And it's a tricky question. Our documentary, equally, time-wise, focuses on the police. We travel around with the NYPD on nighttime patrols. We talk to a young Black rookie who is patrolling the streets as a brand new police officer who talks about being afraid and how he has been stopped and how he feels, listen, if I fit the description, someone should stop me. If I haven't done anything wrong, I shouldn't have a problem with it. So we really wanted to try to capture the nuance and the difficulty of doing the job, but also doing it in a way that is fair for everyone.
Was it difficult for you to get police to speak with you on the record? I was surprised that young rookie spoke with you, because the only other active duty officer you spoke with in this documentary requested to have his identity masked.
Well, we had another one as well, a lieutenant who took us around on patrol. So we had two officers who were happy to talk to us, and then the one officer who was telling us about the quota system that he believes exists, and who was telling us that, listen, it's been made very clear to me as a police officer, when there are young white teenagers who are smoking pot at some event, we are not supposed to, stop them. If they're young Black men, we are. Like, that was his sense of his marching orders. So he was the only one who we did in shadow. It wasn't. I thought the NYPD was incredibly generous with their time, trying to get the commissioner, just because his schedule is insane, was really hard, but they were great, and I think they understood that the way to tell the story well and fairly was to take part in it and talk to us and give us an officer who can explain the perspective from that side. I mean, the point for me in documentary is understanding someone's perspective.
And his perspective was interesting to see the fear and to hear him talking about the aggressive policing, talking about how the job is more numbers based often than safety based, and how you can just ruin a person's life, a young man's life, because of the need of a number.
The commissioner would dispute that. He said we do not have a quota system, but he understood that maybe there are some people who believe there are. We were told by the undercover, the police officer who we did in shadow, that there is a number system. He believed, listen, there is a very clear quota system. You have a number of people, and you have to get, have to make a certain number of arrests and summonses and things like that. So I think a lot of it is still sort of up for debate, depending on who you ask. But For our officer who was a rookie who took us around and talked about what it's like to be a brand new police officer. His dad was a cop, he's African American, he's very proud of being a police officer, and yet he understands, like, it's complicated in a neighborhood like Bed-Stuy. He grew up in that very same neighborhood.
Which makes it different because many times people feel like it's the outsiders looking in.
And often it is the outsiders.
It is often the outsiders. The other individual, Luis, we see in the documentary, is in the middle of a lawsuit against NYPD. Since filming ended, do we have any closure to his story?
No, not yet. And, you know, the wheels of justice move very slowly. This is a young man named Luis who, a taxi driver, happened to capture the moment when he was being pummeled by, it looked to me, about 6 or 7 police officers. And it's just a brutal attack. And he kind of walks me through what happens. But at the end, they handcuff him. And you can see him covering his head saying, you know, take me, stop hitting me, stop kicking me. And police are punching. And they pull him up backwards by his wrists, which tore his shoulders. So here's a guy who is a 300-pound football player who now can barely do a single push-up because of the damage that was sustained. He was put in jail overnight, and the next morning the charges were dropped. There are no charges against him, right? So he now is suing the city. And last year, I believe the number is something like the police, NYPD paid out $98 million in civil rights violations. So there clearly is an issue. And at the bottom line, I think, is if you can solve this, one, you can save the city money, because that money comes from us taxpayers. But you also can figure out how to make a community want and value the police, right? The best kind of intelligence is human intelligence. You want people on the ground to respect you so that when there's a problem, they will pick up the phone and say, there is an illegal activity, I need help. You need that. You can't have a confrontational relationship with the very people who are protecting the neighborhood. It's impossible to be successful that way.
The documentary begins with Eric Garner's tragic death, which is also peppered throughout the conversation, along with the cell phone video of Luis being detained and other individuals. You see time and time again and hear time and time again individuals sharing their stories of injustice, not just stories and tales and anecdotes, but hard evidence. Soledad, is it difficult to remain unbiased when you're in the trenches and you're trying to tell a story and trying to show all of the sides? When you see these communities and these individuals terrorized, is it difficult?
You know, my job, I think, as a documentarian is to make sure someone gets a platform for their view. So whether you're talking to Keishan Harley or you're talking to the commissioner, the police commissioner of the city of New York, he gets to have his perspective on the challenges and the opportunities. And so I never think of it as it needs to be framed and colored by me. In both cases, we're going to talk to them, challenge them, ask them questions. But, you know, my bias is I live in a great neighborhood. The police would never stop someone on my street, push them against the wall, and check their bag. Ever. You know, so I don't have that experience that Keishan Harley has. There are people who smoke pot on my street all the time. The police would no sooner roll up on them and arrest them. But that happens all the time in neighborhoods that are primarily minority and neighborhoods that are poor. And so I don't have that experience. So I don't feel particularly biased, like, hey, this is my neighborhood of Bed-Stuy. Ever. I think a documentarian's role is to really allow the police commissioner his say, to talk to people in the community and allow that story to unfold in a way that maybe people haven't heard different perspectives.
So you don't have that personal experience, but you have this experience in talking to these individuals. I
think that they deserve to have airtime, right? The fact that this conversation, the first Black in America doc we did in 2008, I sat down with D.L. Hughley, and he told me the story of sitting with his son when he was 12 years old, and he said, and I told him, if you are stopped by the police, make sure your hands are in a place where they can see them. No sudden movements. Tell them, I want to call my dad. Do not reach for your phone. Do not. And as we continue to shoot that documentary, meanwhile, D.L. Hughley, who is a wealthy man living in Hollywood, California, almost verbatim the same story by a woman in poverty talking about her 13-year-old son. I tell him, whatever you do, no sudden movements. You've got to be careful if you are stopped by the police. So the fact that all these many years later, we had an opportunity to to tell that story in a documentary, I think, is a great opportunity. I don't think that's bias. I think it's just a great story to bring forward.
Telling the story in a documentary and hoping for movement forward are two different things, but they can move forward together. I have a little brown boy. He's 4 years old. You have twin boys. Hughie's son, obviously, when you step outside of your own community, you're not safe. Maybe on your street, your kids can smoke pot, but who knows how the world might see them. Do you see movement forward since you started series?
I think the fact that we're even having this conversation, and one of the reasons we took Black in America on tour was an opportunity to take some of these conversations that we're having within the documentary and open them up to a larger audience. Because I do think, just by virtue of people talking about the privilege that comes when people have certain expectations of you that are correlated to your race, is a step forward. No one used the word white privilege 8 years ago. I mean, I remember people would talk about it in these pitch meetings in the newsroom, and people would roll their eyes and be like, no one wants to talk about that. And now that's a word, words that we actually hear a lot, this idea that you will be treated differently based on the color of your skin. I think certainly here in New York there is an expectation of that, and I think we've seen it. The numbers absolutely support that. So I believe just by virtue of having this conversation, we're on a path to having a serious discussion about how to fix it. In New York City, the NYPD, they lost the lawsuit. Change has to come. The number of people who were stopped, questioned, and frisked has gone down dramatically. Also, crime continues to go down, right? There was a sense that somehow all stopping and frisking people was helping bring the crime rate down. We haven't seen that correlation. I think any time you challenge figures and numbers like that, you're heading the right direction.
So when we're looking at this and you're talking about the things you see on tour, you're currently in the middle of your tour. You have been to 2 cities and you're on your way to multiple more. What are you seeing come up in the conversations as you take this across the nation?
I love it. It's great. The tours are a lot of college campuses, so I think there are 20-somethings who are really grappling with this issue about how to protest and how to use their voice, and what do you do if you're frustrated? Like, you're a college student. What actually can you tangibly do? How do you make a difference? I think the moment in the Eric Garner choking to death, right, was that even people who are very conservative, a Glenn Beck, and someone who's incredibly liberal, and Al Sharpton, were in agreement. They're like, look at that video. We saw a man killed, right? We saw him killed in a video. And yet, and interestingly, right, he does this. Eric Garner, I've seen the video now a million times. He does that. That was resisting arrest, right? He said, he pulls his hand back. And I think it really spurred a conversation of like, oh, so that's what resisting arrest is? Imagine what this conversation would be if there had been no video, right? If we said, here's a guy, big guy, he was stopped, he was resisting arrest, the police officers felt afraid for their lives, and they brought him down, and in the process of bringing him down, as he resisted, he died. That's a very different story than what people, I think, see in the video. And that's what made that video so striking for people, regardless of race, regardless of where they stand politically. It was a moment of, wow, we really need to think about this policing and how people approach people that they're thinking about arresting. I mean, keep in mind the context. Eric Garner was suspected of selling loosies, which I had never heard about until I started covering this story, which is a loose cigarette, a single cigarette. If you don't have the money to buy the entire pack, you can buy a single cigarette for 75 cents. So what was at risk was a 75-cent cigarette that they believed that he might have been selling. I don't think there's anyone in this room who would say, well, you know what, hey, listen, it's worth dying over a 75-cent cigarette. It's worth killing a person over that. I think these kinds of issues, stop, question, and frisk, this broken windows policy, which exists here in New York City, right? The philosophy that if you don't stamp out little crime, it'll grow into big crime. It encourages these interactions with police that can become deadly very fast.
What are you hoping comes of these conversations with these teenagers in early 20s when they are at the beginning of their adult life, when they are finding themselves and figuring out their place in the world? What are you hoping? Are you hoping to inspire activism? Are you hoping to bring awareness?
I think it allows them to just have a conversation where they don't necessarily feel like they're crazy, right? They are able to ask questions and talk about what they're feeling and thinking in a context that's not really been discussed very much, especially for minority students on campuses that are primarily majority white campuses. They often feel like nobody cares about their issue. And so I think in a way it's a way of really supporting that conversation that they're trying to have already. I think when you're trying to have a conversation, just hearing people and bringing people into the room where you say, actually, this is a conversation, which means regardless of your perspective, we want to hear it. Often the counsel that I give these young people is, you can't claim to have a conversation and try to shut everybody up. You have to really have a conversation, right? It can't be, come to my conversation, but just so you know, I'm right. I don't want to hear what you say. You have to say, let's really talk about this issue and talk about this issue with statistics and facts and figures and history, all of those things that we can bring as we bring the tour into their college town.
When you say you don't want them to feel crazy, you want them to have a safe space where they can experience and explore these feelings. Back when you started Black in America, when you said no one was talking about white privilege, back in the day, so long ago, 2008, when you say that the white privilege wasn't a term bandied about, did you ever feel like people thought you were crazy? Did you feel that you were crazy for wanting to take this project
I remember
on?
having a conversation with my boss's boss's boss and about this very thing. And I said, the thing that I thought was most interesting about our documentary, in fact, we were at TCA, which is the cable, where they launch cable shows, talk about what's coming up for the next year. And I was telling this very story about the D.L. Hughley thing. And my boss said, I just don't think that's true. White people talk to their kids about the police. And I said, you're not understanding. It's a different conversation. He said, no, you're wrong. I'm like, okay, I'm wrong. But I'm not wrong. I know that. And I think his perspective is an interesting one because it allows, again, to have a debate about, well, what is the nuance in that conversation? But he really doesn't think at the time, and I think maybe his thinking has changed, I don't think he really thought that there was a difference in, surviving the interaction. One of the things that I thought was so interesting, I forget the exact name, what was that hashtag? Remember where the people were submitting their stories of what they did, they would drive on the median of the road. They were drunk and they would harass a cop. They would do, I can't remember the name of the hashtag. It was just all these stories.
If anyone wants to throw
Driving while white, right? All these priming while white. Right, and it was so interesting.
Thank you, Hive Mind.
Yeah, appreciate it. And just interesting to see sort of these people beginning to realize, like, all the stuff that they did as just a dumb ass, am I allowed to say that? 20-year-old, was the kind of stuff that would have gotten them arrested and maybe even killed in an interaction with police, but they were just doing it as a stupid suburban kid who decided to cut across the highway, who decided that, they would spit in the cop's face, they would do that, and in some cases the cops would drive them home, the police officer knew their parent, they were treated differently because they were suburban kids, and they were, treated like they're just idiots, and let's get them back safely to their parents. I think that for African Americans, the experience is a very different one. There is a very different one.
And that experience is shared not only in Black and Blue, but in the other installments of Black in America. I'd like to take this opportunity to open it up to anyone who'd like to ask questions about this installment, other installments, or other aspects of Soledad's life. Please raise your hand if you would like to share or ask. Right there, in the red beret.
Hey, Soror. So, the other day I was taking a picture with my sorors. This is a Delta Sigma Theta, which is a sorority that I belong to as an honorary member, and my soror here is sporting our colors. And literally, I can't tell you the number of times the Deltas have the triangle is their sign, where people would say, "Are you throwing up gang sign?" Like, seriously? No. I mean, this is like
criming while Soledad.
Like, how insane is that? Like, really? Are you really asking me that question? So, with that, hi, Soror.
Hi, Soror. I find it so interesting, and I'm glad that you're actually continuing your Black in America series. And I find it interesting because a lot of times with our president being Black and other advances Black people have made, that a lot of people want to act like we're post-racial.
Racism has been solved.
Exactly. And so there's Beyonce and Jay-Z, so we're all good. And so I just want to know from you, what is your impetus for saying, you know what, once, twice is not enough. We need to keep having this conversation.
I get this all the time where people are like, listen, it's been 7 of them. Oh, for God's sakes, isn't that enough? How many more stories do black people have? Let's wrap it up already. I just think that anytime there's an interesting story to tell about an experience that maybe a lot of people don't necessarily know about, or that's interesting to explore, then we should be there to tell that. We don't do PR, right? My goal is not to tell, good stories about good black Americans or bad stories. It's really just to tell stories about the human experience that is a different one for African Americans. And I think we will continue to tell those stories for as long as we're able, as long as there's good material to tell.
Anyone else?
Hi, I'd actually like to talk about another documentary which you were recently featured in.
Light Girls. I haven't seen that yet. Was it good? Did people like it? No, she hated it.
No. Hello, everyone.
I like the roaming. She gets the mic. She's like doing her own show now. Go ahead.
My question really is, obviously, for those who are not familiar, it drew a couple of mixed reactions. Some felt there wasn't enough self-interrogation by the women who were featured. Others questioned who exactly was featured, and it kind of extended that conversation of colorism, and just also the inclusion of men. So just for what you have heard, or because you mentioned that you haven't seen it, or what you're hearing from perhaps from colleagues, what's your general take? Do you feel that it's done its job?
So it's hard to say, because I have not seen the documentary, and I will speak for documentarians when I tell you it's everybody has it. Even my own mother, after we did the first Black in America, is like, oh, no Afro-Cubans, your own people didn't even make it into your own little documentary. So like everybody's a critic, right? Everybody has a sense of, well, if I had done that documentary, here is the way. So I will couch it in that. I did see a lot of mixed reaction just on Twitter, because I was traveling a lot and I didn't have an opportunity to see it, and I wanted to see it. I did think, we did a documentary a couple of years ago for Black in America on colorism, and I think it's a really interesting issue. I do think you have challenges when you have some of the things that I think some of those guys were saying, I think people felt were kind of out in left field. So because I was not the producer of that doc, I just happened to be interviewed in that doc. And the things that I said in that doc, I thought that they reflected very well, right? Which to me was, there is privilege if you're light-skinned, period. There is a reason most TV anchors, at least before the last 5 years, look like me, right? It has been made very clear to me. So I think those are good conversations to have. I think it's a good place to start. I think that there is, digging into racism in any conversation is always uncomfortable and icky, but I think it's a good conversation to have. I love Bill Duke, and I think he's a wildly talented filmmaker. So I always err on the side of, have that conversation, and have people give their feedback and say if they hated it or loved it. So, I tried to best answer the questions as honestly as I could, but bear in mind, for some of the people who were in the doc, some of the things were left on the cutting room floor, I'm sure.
Piggybacking on that, one of the things you've said is one of the conversations that perhaps hasn't evolved as much is in movements is the diversity of guests in the media, not just newscasters, but also people who do media hits, people who are on the screen, that you feel that the conversations are still kind of the same.
I will tell you a great story. So once I was doing a story on, it must have been Iraq. I was working at CNN, and we used to have the same people. We had the same miscellaneous 58-year-old grizzly white guy would be our Iraq expert. And at one point I was like, oh, for God's sakes, is there not one black woman in America who can speak knowledgeably about Iraq? I was at Harvard is the college that I attended, and I was at a conference, and I said that, and this woman raised her hand. She's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She said, I am an expert on Iraq. Black woman. I'm like, I need your information. I could not get that woman on TV as hard. It was so hard to get somebody.
Was it hard because she didn't want to be?
She was dying to do it. It was just like, well, she hasn't been on Why would we take, if she hasn't been on, we don't know how she'll be when she's on.
Who was specifically
Girl,
holding?
I want to continue to work in this business.
How will we know if a tree falls? Doesn't make a sound.
You know, I think that is a metaphor for how it works, right? Which is like, oh, we would love to have more women on this issue. However, we haven't really heard from women on this issue. We don't really want to try it on this, so we'll go with the guy we know who's really good. And then you are in this vicious cycle of the pipeline. I really, really want to do it, but the pipeline. Look, there are people, they don't have the experience. It's like, well, how is she going to get the experience if we don't give her the opportunity to have the experience? And thus your pipeline issue. So when you later look back to pick someone, do you take the guy who's been on 150 times? Do you take the woman who's been on 3 times? And obviously you get better the more you're on. Or do you take this person over here who's never really had an opportunity and you're going to, be risking it all to pick that person? I know what you're going to do. You're going to pick the guy. He's been on 150 times. He's very good. We know. So he'll get it yet again, and it'll be perfectly rational. But you realize you're creating your own pipeline issue. It happened all the time, and it was so frustrating.
I hate to make a plug right here, but Jessica and I work at HuffPost Live, where we take experts, whether you've been on television 1 time or 1,000 times. So please reach out to us. We love diversity in our AOL family.
And guess what? But the first time is always a little rocky. The 10th time is better. The 100th time, that's the way it is for everybody. So I do hope that it's a great way to get more voices, into the conversation.
I love that. So yes, continue the conversation, please. Does anyone else have a question right here? Hello.
Hi. I just want to know what you think of social media and what role it plays, like all these hashtags when having these kinds of conversations and when these kinds of tragedies strike.
Oh my God. First of all, I love social media so much. I'm addicted to Twitter. It is so sad. I roll out of bed and before I even check on the health and welfare of my 4 children, I'm like, what's happening on Twitter? So I think it's great. I think it's a really interesting way to tap into conversations. I think people need to not be naive about what a hashtag can accomplish, but it is a way of grouping and gathering people, right? I think the power of the internet is, helping to make sure that like-minded people can find each other, and I think social media does that incredibly well.
I think with hashtags, it's impressive what hashtags can do. We have Black Lives Matter and so many other hashtags that have made
I think Black Lives Matter is kind of like I am a man, right? Like we have to tell people Black Lives Matter. There's something very sad in that. Yes, Black Lives Matter. Obviously, Black Lives Matter. Isn't that sad? I think that should depress people, that we have to remind them that Black Lives Matter.
That's what Black in America does.
Right. I think it's sad. I think there's something really sad about Black people matter. Yeah, people should be running around saying, no crap, Black people matter. Obviously, I find that if you remember when you've seen those signs from the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968, I think, where they're walking around those signs that say, I am a man. There's something just so deflating about seeing that, right? It's just so depressing, because you're like, wow, you have to walk around with a sign that says you're a man?
So when you wake up in the morning and you check on your Twitter hashtags before your children, you see hashtag Black Lives Matter, that deflates you?
I think it absolutely deflates me in the way of where we are in society, that we have to remind people that Black Lives Matter. The way that in the 1960s, you had to remind people that Black sanitation workers were human beings. Yeah, I think it's poignant, it's making a point, but it's sad. I think, I hope we can get to the point where everybody assumes that. Yeah, I think that's a sad thing, absolutely.
We have time for one more question. Hi, I work with Nancy on HuffPost Live. Hi, Nancy.
Hello.
Going back to the topic of the TV and the media, what do you think is the media's responsibility in not reinforcing stereotypes? And I have a very clear example, basically Don Lemon in Ferguson saying, there's an obvious smell of marijuana and things like that people perceive right away and they think, oh, typical. I think, what do you think is?
For me, reporting in some ways is all about just honestly saying what's unfolding. Really, it's as easy and as hard as that. It's about calling things as you see them and giving context. So I wasn't there in Ferguson. I have no idea what Don was talking about. But I do know that it's really critical to be very careful with your words and careful how you describe communities. Certainly in Hurricane Katrina, there were lots of there's a lot of opportunities to dehumanize people, right? There's just so many opportunities where you can paint somebody with a broad brush of they live in the ghetto, they're poor, they have a single mom, and we do it all the time, and the media does it all the time. We use this little code word, right? And we're all like, we know what that means. Oh, they live in the ghetto. We know the paragraph that follows next. So to me, one of the challenges and opportunities, certainly as we reported Black in America, was to push people to describe people as human beings with lives, not just say, so-and-so's, this is a real example, so-and-so's mom is a crack addict and her dad is an alcoholic. That's not how we would ever describe a white suburban boy who's 12 years old, right? We would never say that. We would say, little Billy Bob is 12 years old. He loves baseball. Derek Jeter is his favorite player, and he's hoping one day to blah, 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 blah. He's saving up money so he can buy a baseball mitt, and he just took on a paper route and blah, 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 blah. And then we talk about his mom and dad. When we come to people of color, and especially people in poverty, we use these shorthands all the time. Her mom's a crack addict. Her dad's an alcoholic. And it's like, well, what does that tell us about that person, that individual? It tells us nothing. It's our shorthand of saying, underprivileged, poor, dysfunctional. That's not a description of a person. That's a description of her parents. And so one of the things that we try to do in Black in America, and I think you, as a journalist, have to push constantly to the point of becoming an annoyance, is just remind people that people have their own story. And it's empowering to make people the center of their own story. We get to be the heroes in our own story. And you have to say, no, this girl is a B student. She plays lacrosse. She's a peer tutor. This is who she is. Yes, she has a dysfunctional mom. It's relevant to her story. Her dad has a problem. It's relevant to her story. But that's not who she is. And it's that constant fight for humanizing people, I think, that the media needs to constantly keep in mind and push back against these urges for the shorthand to dehumanize people.
And on that note, as you are continuing to create these stories, you're also continuing to shape lives outside of the documentaries and outside of your work. I want to leave this with everyone in case there's someone in their life that they're hoping to shape. I would just like for you to say a few short words on the O'Brien Raymond Starfish Foundation.
Yeah, we started the Starfish Foundation. We send girls to college. And we believe that when you invest in young women and you help pave the way for them to go to college, that you really can change their lives, whether they're going to Princeton, as some of our girls are, or Smith College, or Boricua College, or Broward Community College, whatever it is, we know that an investment in their education is critical. And it's been probably one of the most rewarding things to do, to be able to help young women fulfill their dreams, because college is not just about paying for college, which we do, but it's about, pushing, pulling, cheerleading, helping.
And how many young women have you
We
been
send
able to
25 girls a year to college.
That's
and
incredible.
so we're starting our 5th year. So thank you for asking about that. I appreciate it. It's been a real joy for us.
And we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for sharing yourself and your work with us today. For more information, all of you can check out the Facebook page for Black in America. The 7th installment is Black and Blue. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.